January 26, 1966. Australia Day. On the surface, it was the kind of day that summers are made of, the kind of day that lives in memory not as a date, but as a feeling. Bright, hot, limitless. The South Australian sun was relentless that morning, burning the sky a deeper and deeper shade of blue as it climbed higher and higher into the heavens. At Glenelg Beach in Adelaide, families were already staking their territory, spreading towels, digging holes, building sand castles that would be demolished by the tide before the day ended. Nobody knew that some of those families were about to bear witness to something that would haunt the nation for decades to come. Nobody knew that January 26, 1966 would be remembered not for fireworks or celebrations, but for an absence, for 3 children who walked into the afternoon and never walked out. This is the story of Jane, Arnna, and Grant Beaumont. 3 kids, a summer day, and a mystery so complete, so absolute, that 50 years later, we're still asking the same questions. Where did they go? What happened to them? And why? Despite everything we know about forensic science, despite advances in technology that would have seemed like science fiction in 1966, why have we never been able to find them? The answer might be scarier than any of us want to admit. To understand what was lost on Australia Day 1966, you have to understand who these children were. Jane Beaumont was 9 years old, not quite old enough to be a teenager, but far enough removed from childhood that she carried herself with the kind of self-awareness that comes with being the oldest. Her mother, Marion, would later describe her as responsible, as the kind of child you could trust, the kind of daughter who looked after her younger siblings not because she had to, but because she wanted to. She had her father's features, her mother's eyes. She was growing into herself the way 9-year-old girls do, not quite beautiful, but on the edge of becoming. Arnna was 7, middle child, the connecting link. She was lighter, brighter somehow, quick to laugh, quick to smile, more social than her older sister, more willing to approach strangers and make friends within minutes. At 7 years old, Arnna still moved through the world with the kind of unself-conscious joy that adults spend their entire lives trying to recapture. She was the kind of kid who could make friends anywhere, the kind of kid who would have grown into something special. And little Grant was only 4 years old, still in that liminal space where childhood feels like it will last forever. He followed his sisters everywhere they went, still small enough that they could hold his hand and lead him places. He had that baby face quality that 4-year-olds have, the round cheeks, the wide eyes, the simple wonder of a world that hasn't yet disappointed him. Grant was the youngest, the most vulnerable, the one who needed the most. They came from an ordinary family. Their father, Jim Beaumont, was a hard-working Australian man. Their mother, Marion, was a devoted parent raising 4 children in a modest Adelaide home. By any measure, they were a normal family, not wealthy, not poor, just ordinary people living ordinary lives in the middle of an ordinary Australian suburb, which is what makes what happened next so profoundly, impossibly wrong. On the morning of January 26, 1966, Marion Beaumont decided to take her children to the beach. It wasn't unusual. It was a public holiday. It was hot. The beach was the obvious choice. She packed a bag. She gathered her children. The youngest, her baby, would stay home with a babysitter. But Jane, Arnna, and Grant would come. 3 children, heading to the beach on Australia Day, heading towards something none of them could see coming. Glenelg Beach in 1966 was different from what it is today. There was no fancy development, no massive pier, no modern amenities. It was simply a beach, a long stretch of sand where families came to escape the summer heat and spend time in the sun and water. On Australia Day 1966, it was crowded, busy, the kind of place where it was easy to lose track of individual faces in the sea of humanity. Marion Beaumont found a spot and began to settle in. She was pregnant at the time, carrying her 5th child due that summer. She was tired. The heat was oppressive. She was wearing a sundress and a hat, trying to manage 4 children and her pregnant body in the South Australian heat. It wasn't easy. By most accounts, she was doing her best, the way mothers always do. Around midday, Jane, Arnna, and Grant asked if they could go get some food. They wanted to visit the shops near the beach, the little kiosks and shops that sold ice cream and hot dogs, and all the treats that made a day at the beach memorable. Marion gave them money. She gave them instructions. And then she did something that, in hindsight, would become the thing that haunts her forever. She let them go. There was nothing unusual about this. Children were more independent in 1966 than they are today. Allowing a 9-year-old to take her younger siblings to get food was a normal thing, a reasonable thing. Nobody was negligent here. Nobody was being reckless. Marion Beaumont was simply doing what parents did in 1966. She was letting her children have a small taste of independence. She was trusting them to make good decisions. She was, in every way that matters, being a responsible parent. The children left to go to the shops. And then the hours began to pass. 1 hour, 2 hours, 3 hours. Marion waited for them to return. The sun climbed higher in the sky. The beach remained crowded. Families came and went. The afternoon heat grew more intense. And still, Jane, Arnna, and Grant did not come back. At some point, Marion Beaumont realized that something was wrong. This wasn't the kind of delay that could be explained by a long queue or a misplaced coin. This was something else. This was silence. This was absence. This was a moment when the perfect summer day began to curdle into something terrible. She went to look for them. She searched the shops. She asked shopkeepers if they'd seen 3 children, a girl of 9, a girl of 7, and a boy of 4. Some shopkeepers remembered selling ice cream to children, but it was Australia Day. There were hundreds of children at Glenelg Beach that day. Nobody could be sure which children they'd served. The descriptions were too generic, too easy to confuse with any other group of young kids. Marion's search became more frantic. She went back to the beach. She asked other beachgoers if they'd seen her children. She described them. She looked for them in the water, in the rocks, in every possible place a child might go. Hours were passing now. The afternoon was turning toward evening, and there was no sign of Jane, Arnna, and Grant Beaumont. At some point, the search became official. Police were called. And then, slowly, inexorably, the terrible truth began to crystallize. The children had vanished. In the first hours after Marion Beaumont reported her children missing, there was still hope. Not hope based on evidence or reason, but hope based on the simple fact that missing children are usually found. They turn up, they get lost and then found. They wander away and then are discovered. This is the pattern of missing children stories. They disappear and they come back, a little scared maybe, but intact. Police arrived at Glenelg Beach, and they began the process of searching. They called in extra officers. They searched the beach, the shops, the surrounding areas. They took statements from Marion Beaumont and other beachgoers who might have seen something. They organized search parties. They put out descriptions of the children. It was the appropriate response to a child disappearance. The response that typically, statistically, leads to a positive outcome. But as the hours stretched into the evening, as the sun began to set on Australia Day 1966, something became clear. This wasn't going to follow the typical pattern. These children weren't turning up. They weren't being found. They had vanished as completely as if they'd stepped into another dimension. By nightfall, the search had expanded. Police brought in more officers. They brought in dogs. They searched not just the beach, but the surrounding suburbs. They searched parks and vacant land. They searched houses and backyards. They searched everywhere a child might logically go if they were lost or confused. Nothing, no sign of them, no trace of them, as if 3 children had simply ceased to exist at some point after they left their mother at the beach. The newspapers picked up the story. Children missing at Glenelg Beach. The headlines were stark, simple, frightening. By the next morning, Australia Day 1966 had been transformed from a day of celebration into a day of tragedy. The beaches that had been filled with families celebrating their nation were now filled with police and volunteers searching for 3 missing children. Posters went up. Descriptions were broadcast. The police appealed for information. Anyone who had seen 3 children, Jane Beaumont, age 9, Arnna Beaumont, age 7, Grant Beaumont, age 4, was asked to come forward. The public became involved. The search expanded beyond the police into the community itself. Hundreds of people began to search for the Beaumont children. But search as they might, no one could find them. As the hours became days and the days became weeks, the nature of the mystery began to shift. Initial hope that the children had gotten lost, that they were simply confused or scared, gave way to darker possibilities. The question changed from where could they have gone to what happened to them. The first theory was the most straightforward and, in many ways, the most terrifying: abduction. Given the timeline, given the geography of Glenelg Beach, given the fact that 3 children vanished without a trace, it became increasingly clear that someone had taken them. The children didn't simply get lost. The children didn't wander away and end up confused. Someone had taken them. This wasn't an accident or misadventure. This was something deliberate, something intentional, something that someone had planned or at least capitalized on. Police began to focus on suspects. Men who had been seen at the beach that day. Men who had a history of crime. Men who fit certain profiles. There was no shortage of suspects in the early weeks and months of the investigation, but none of them could be connected to the missing children. None of them could be proven to have taken Jane, Arnna, and Grant. But the theory persisted. Abduction. Someone had taken these children. Someone who knew them or someone who didn't. Someone who had a reason or someone who was simply driven by darkness. The investigation focused on finding this person. The police interviewed suspects. They took statements. They followed leads. But every lead seemed to evaporate before it could solidify into actual evidence. Weeks became months. Months became years. And still, there was no sign of the Beaumont children. Some people theorized that the children had drowned. Perhaps they had gone to the beach without Marion's knowledge. Perhaps they had gone into the water despite not being strong swimmers. Perhaps they had gotten caught in a rip or a current. Perhaps their bodies were somewhere in the ocean, pulled out to sea by forces beyond their control. This theory was appealing in some ways because it at least provided a kind of closure, natural tragedy rather than human cruelty. But if they had drowned, where were their bodies? The ocean, while vast, still returns things. Clothing, shoes, the small remnants of a life. But nothing was ever found. No piece of clothing that belonged to the Beaumont children. No shoes. No jewelry. Nothing that could confirm they had ever entered the water at all. Other theories emerged. Conspiracy theories. Theories that suggested the children had been taken for some sinister purpose. Theories that suggested they had been sold. Theories that suggested they had been taken across state lines. Theories that suggested, well, theories were everywhere, but evidence was nowhere. The investigation continued, but it was hampered by time and the lack of physical evidence. In 1966, forensic science was not what it is today. There were no DNA databases. There were no security cameras. There were no cell phones that could be tracked. There was only eyewitness testimony, which was notoriously unreliable, and physical evidence, which seemed to not exist. The Beaumont children had vanished into mystery. No one suffered more from the disappearance of the Beaumont children than Marion Beaumont herself. She had been a good mother. By every account, she had done nothing wrong. She had been pregnant, tired, trying to manage her children at the beach on a hot summer day. She had allowed them a small degree of independence, something every parent does, something that was completely normal and appropriate in 1966. And in that moment of normal, in that moment of everyday parenting, everything had changed. Her children were gone. In the days and weeks after the disappearance, Marion Beaumont became the subject of intense scrutiny. This was a time before DNA testing, before forensic science could provide clear answers. When a child went missing, parents were often the first suspects. Did the mother do something? Was she responsible? Did she lose her temper? Did something happen that she wasn't telling the police? The police questioned her extensively. They went over her timeline again and again. They asked her to recount every moment from the time she arrived at the beach to the time she realized her children were missing. They wanted to know every detail, every decision, every moment of every hour. And Marion answered their questions again and again, telling the same story because it was the truth. But the suspicion lingered. There were people who whispered that Marion knew more than she was saying. There were people who believed she was involved. There were theories that suggested she had harmed her children, and invented the missing children story to cover it up. These theories were, by any reasonable standard, absurd, but they persisted anyway, as ugly rumors tend to do. Marion Beaumont lived the rest of her life under this shadow. She had lost her children, 3 of her 4, in a single afternoon, and she had also lost something else, her freedom from suspicion. She would carry both losses for the rest of her life. There are photographs of Marion Beaumont from the days and weeks after the disappearance. In every photograph, her face is a study in anguish, the hollow eyes, the tight mouth, the physical manifestation of a woman whose world has collapsed. She has given interviews over the decades. She has appeared on television programs about the case. And in every interview, the pain is visible. The not knowing is visible. The loss is visible. Marion Beaumont died in 2009, still not knowing what happened to her children. She went to her grave with the question unanswered. She died without closure, without the small comfort that comes with knowing, even if it's terrible knowledge. She died wondering where they were, what they were, if they had suffered, if they had called for her. This is one of the cruelest aspects of the Beaumont case. It's not just a mystery of the children's disappearance. It's the lifetime of suffering that the parents endured. It's the way a single afternoon can destroy an entire family, not just by taking the children, but by taking the parents' peace forever. There is one name that appears in the Beaumont case more than any other name. One man who fits the profile, who had the opportunity, who had a history that makes him a plausible suspect. His name was Derek Percy. Derek Percy was a naval sailor. He was stationed in Adelaide at the time the Beaumont children disappeared. He was known to frequent Glenelg Beach. He had a history of sexual interest in children. He had committed crimes, serious crimes, against children in the past, and he had been investigated in connection with the Beaumont disappearance. When you examine Derek Percy's history, when you look at his crimes and his locations and his movements, something becomes apparent. He is connected to a disturbing number of child disappearances and murders in Australia during the 1960s and 1970s. The Beaumont children, the Wanda Beach murders, other disappearances and crimes that remain unsolved or partially solved. Percy's shadow looms over all of them. The police suspected Percy. They questioned him. They investigated him extensively. But they could never prove that he was responsible for the Beaumont children's disappearance. There was no physical evidence. There were no eyewitnesses who could definitively place him at the scene. There was suspicion and theory in the dark pattern of his history, but there was no proof. Derek Percy died in prison in 2022. He had been incarcerated for other crimes against children, other evidence of the darkness that lived inside him. But he was never prosecuted for the Beaumont children's disappearance. The case against him remained circumstantial. And so he died in prison, and the mystery of the Beaumont children died with him, unresolved, unexplained. Or did it? Some people believe that before he died, Derek Percy confessed to other crimes, to other dark deeds. Some people believe that if you knew the full extent of Percy's crimes, if you knew every place he had been and every child he had targeted, you would have a clearer picture of what happened on Australia Day 1966. But Derek Percy's full confession, if there is one, remains hidden, locked away by law and privacy, and the secrets that men take to their graves. The Derek Percy theory is the most compelling theory in the Beaumont case. It fits the timeline. It fits the geography. It fits the profile of the crimes. But it is also a theory built on suspicion rather than proof. And in a legal system, suspicion is not enough. Proof is required. And proof is something that, in the Beaumont case, has proven impossible to obtain. In the days and weeks after the Beaumont children disappeared, the police collected hundreds of eyewitness statements. Hundreds of people who claimed to have seen something, someone, anything that might be relevant to the case. The beach had been crowded that day. There were families everywhere. There were strangers. And somewhere in that sea of faces was the answer to what happened to Jane, Arnna, and Grant. Or so they hoped. One of the most significant pieces of evidence in the Beaumont case came from eyewitnesses who reported seeing 3 children being led away from the beach area by an adult male. The description was vague. It was 1966. The beach was crowded. People weren't paying close attention to other people's children, but it existed. Someone had seen something. Someone had witnessed a possible abduction and hadn't realized at the time what they were witnessing. There were other sightings, too. Reports of a man and 3 children traveling together. Reports of a man matching Derek Percy's description in the vicinity of the beach. Reports of cars seen in the area that day. None of it was conclusive. All of it was suspect to the kind of confusion and false memory that eyewitness testimony is prone to. The problem with eyewitness evidence in the Beaumont case is that it creates too many possibilities. A dozen different witnesses could have seen a dozen different things. Were they all seeing the same man and the same children? Or were they seeing different men and different children? Without some way to verify, without some concrete evidence to anchor the eyewitness accounts of reality, they remain just stories, just possibilities, just noise in the investigation. This is one of the frustrations of the Beaumont case. There is evidence, but the evidence is not conclusive. There are witnesses, but the witnesses are not reliable. There are theories, but the theories are not provable. The case exists in a space where the truth seems just out of reach, just beyond our ability to grasp it with certainty. Decades later, investigators would re-examine the eyewitness evidence. They would use modern techniques. They would try to piece together what really happened on that day in January. But the fundamental problem remained. By the time they had the tools to do so, too much time had passed. Memories had faded. Witnesses had died. The original scene had changed. The physical evidence that might have been there in 1966 had long since been destroyed or lost. The Beaumont family did not simply accept the disappearance of their children. They could not. Parents do not give up searching for their missing children, and Jim and Marion Beaumont were no exception. They spent years looking for answers. They spent years hoping for a resolution. They spent years holding on to the possibility, no matter how slim, that their children might still be alive somewhere. This is a kind of torture that most of us cannot begin to imagine. Not knowing, never knowing, living in a perpetual state of uncertainty where your children might be alive or dead, suffering or at peace, lost or stolen. The not knowing is sometimes worse than the worst truth, because at least the truth provides closure. The not knowing provides nothing but endless questions. Jim Beaumont went to his grave, still not knowing what happened to his children. Marion outlived him, but only by a few years, and those years were lived in the same twilight of uncertainty. They never had the comfort of knowing. They never had the chance to say goodbye. They were suspended in a kind of purgatory, halfway between hope and despair, unable to move fully in either direction. The Beaumont family gave interviews over the years. They appeared on television programs about the case. They participated in documentaries and investigations. They provided new information when new leads emerged. They kept the case alive, kept it in the public consciousness, never allowing it to completely fade away. In doing so, they performed a kind of service, not just to their own family, but to the broader community. They prevented the Beaumont children from becoming just another cold case, a footnote in the history of Australian crime. But keeping the case alive also meant keeping the pain alive. It meant not moving forward. It meant remaining, in some fundamental way, frozen in January 1966, the day their world ended. Other children were born to Marion and Jim Beaumont. Their remaining child, their youngest, survived and grew up under the shadow of the disappearance. She grew up knowing that her siblings had vanished, knowing that her family was incomplete, knowing that there was a hole at the center of her family that could never be filled. She grew up in a household where grief was a permanent resident, where the absence of 3 children was more present than the presence of 4 who remained. This is a lasting impact of the Beaumont case. It's not just about what happened to the children. It's about what happened to the family. It's about how a single moment can ripple outward, destroying not just 3 lives, but an entire family's capacity for happiness. January 26, 1966, should have been a single day in Australian history. But in the more than 50 years since that day, the search for the Beaumont children has never stopped. It has ebbed and flowed, intensified and receded, but has never truly ceased. In the years immediately following the disappearance, the search was public and visible. Police dredged the ocean. They searched parks and vacant lots. They followed up on thousands of tips and leads. Volunteers joined in the search. Citizens provided information. The case was constantly in the news. There was a sense in those early years that answers might be just around the corner, but the coroners came and went, and no answers emerged. As the years became decades, the nature of the search changed. Professional investigations were supplemented by true crime enthusiasts. Armchair detectives began to examine the case, looking for patterns, looking for clues that professional investigators might have missed. The internet brought new tools for investigation. People could share information across state lines and across the world. Theories could be examined and debated in real time. There were occasional breakthroughs. A potential clue here, a new lead there. In 1997, there was renewed interest in the case when Derek Percy's file was released. In 2006, there was another surge of interest when new information came to light. But none of these breakthroughs led to a definitive answer about what happened to the Beaumont children. The police investigation officially remained open. The case was never officially closed. But the resources dedicated to it waxed and waned over the decades. When other cases demanded attention, the Beaumont case was pushed to the background. When the public renewed interest in the case, resources were redirected. But the fundamental fact remained: no arrest was ever made, no conviction ever secured, no closure ever provided. In 2016, the 50th anniversary of the disappearance, there was a renewed push to solve the case. The South Australian police released a reward for information leading to the resolution of the case. They released new documents. They appealed to the public once more to come forward with information. It was a symbolic gesture, a way of saying that the case had not been forgotten, that the Beaumont children had not been forgotten. But 50 years is a long time. Potential witnesses have died. Evidence has been lost or destroyed. The community that might remember something from 1966 has mostly aged out of our world. And the brutal truth is that some cases, no matter how much we want them solved, no matter how many resources we devote to them, simply remain unsolved. To understand the Beaumont case, you need to understand Derek Percy. And to understand Derek Percy, you need to understand the full scope of his crimes and the way he haunted Australian waters and Australian communities for years. Derek Percy was born in 1948. By his mid-teens, he had already developed an obsession with young children. This wasn't something that emerged later in his life, or that was a result of circumstance. It was fundamental to his nature. He sought out opportunities to be around children. He sought out positions that would give him access to children, and he used that access for unspeakable purposes. In 1965, a year before the Beaumont children disappeared, Derek Percy had been in Adelaide, stationed there with the Royal Australian Navy. He had a history of disturbing behavior. He had been noted as having a problem with young children. He was known to be unstable. He was known to be dangerous. And yet he remained free, remained mobile, remained able to access children. The year after the Beaumont children disappeared, 1967, Derek Percy was in Victoria. And in 1968, something happened that would haunt Australia for years. The Wanda Beach murders occurred in Sydney. 2 young girls were killed. The case became one of Australia's most famous unsolved murders. And decades later, Derek Percy became a suspect in that case as well, just as he was a suspect in the Beaumont case. Over the years, as criminal investigations became more sophisticated, as law enforcement began to examine cases more closely, it became clear that Derek Percy was connected to a pattern of crimes against children. Some crimes that he had been convicted of, some crimes that he had confessed to, some crimes that he was merely suspected of. But the pattern was undeniable. Derek Percy was a predator. He moved from place to place, targeting children, committing crimes, and then moving on. Did he take the Beaumont children? The evidence suggests it's possible. The timeline fits. His location fits. His profile fits. His history of targeting children fits. But, and this is the crucial detail, it cannot be proven. And without proof, without the ability to convince a jury beyond a reasonable doubt, there can be no conviction. This is a frustration of the Beaumont case. The most likely suspect in the case is a man who is now dead, a man who cannot be questioned further, a man who may have taken the secret of what happened to the Beaumont children to his grave. Derek Percy died in January 2022. He had spent decades in prison for other crimes. And when he died, he took with him whatever knowledge he had about the Beaumont children. If he had information, if he had confessed to someone, if he had left some kind of clue, it died with him. The window to solve the case became even narrower. Derek Percy is the most obvious suspect, but he is not the only theory that has emerged over the decades. The Beaumont case has spawned a variety of alternative explanations, each with its own adherents, each with its own logic. One theory suggests that the children were taken by someone they knew, a family friend, an acquaintance, someone who had access to them, and who used that access for sinister purposes. This theory is appealing because it explains how 3 children could be taken without raising immediate alarm. If they were taken by someone they knew, someone they trusted, they might not have resisted. They might not have cried out. Another theory suggests that the children were taken by a group rather than an individual. This theory emerged from some eyewitness accounts that seem to suggest multiple men were involved. A group of pedophiles working together. A ring of predators who took children and either kept them or killed them. This theory has never been substantiated, but it persists in the conspiracy theories that surround the case. There is also the theory, less discussed in polite circles, but nonetheless present, that the children drowned, that they went into the water without their mother's knowledge, that they became caught in a rip, that they died, and that their bodies were never recovered because they were pulled out to sea. This theory has the advantage of not requiring a villain. It's a tragedy rather than a crime. But it has the disadvantage of not explaining the eyewitness accounts of people seeing the children being led away from the beach by an adult. Some theories are more outlandish. Theories about a black market for children. Theories about trafficking rings. Theories that place the children in other states, other countries, living under assumed names. These theories have a kind of narrative appeal, but they lack the grounding in evidence that would make them credible. They are the fantasies of people who want to believe that the children survived, that somewhere out there they are still alive. But perhaps the most compelling alternative theory is not about what happened to the children, but about who took them. Some investigators have suggested that the children might have been taken by someone other than Derek Percy, someone whose name has never emerged in the case, someone who committed the crime and then lived their entire life without being caught, someone who is perhaps still alive, still walking around, still carrying the secret of what happened to Jane, Arnna, and Grant Beaumont. This theory is perhaps the most terrifying of all, because it suggests that the answer to the Beaumont case might be available. The person who knows what happened is still alive, but they have chosen not to speak. They have chosen to remain silent, and they may take their knowledge to their grave just as Derek Percy did. Before the Beaumont children disappeared, Australia was a place where children had a certain kind of freedom. They could play outside without constant supervision. They could go to the beach alone. They could walk to school by themselves. They could be, in many ways, independent and unsupervised in a way that would be considered neglectful today. The disappearance of Jane, Arnna, and Grant Beaumont changed all of that. It wasn't an immediate change. It wasn't something that happened overnight. But over time, the case became a reference point, a warning, a reminder of what could happen when children were allowed to move through the world unsupervised. Parents became more protective. Children were given more rules. The idea of unsupervised children became increasingly seen as a form of parental negligence. In many ways, the Beaumont case marked the beginning of a shift in how Australian culture understood childhood, safety, and the role of parents. This shift was not entirely negative. Increased supervision has almost certainly saved children's lives. Increased awareness of predators has almost certainly resulted in more perpetrators being caught. The heightened vigilance of parents, schools, and communities has created safer spaces for children to grow up in. But there has also been a cost. Childhood is different now. It is more supervised, more controlled, more restricted. Children do not have the same freedom to explore and discover that Jane, Arnna, and Grant had. There is a loss there, a loss of innocence, both for the individual children who grow up in this more restricted world and for the broader culture. The Beaumont case also changed the nature of Australian true crime. Before the Beaumont case, Australian crime coverage was sporadic and local. After the Beaumont case, Australian crime became something that could be discussed nationally. The case became a marker, a turning point. Other cases that came after, the Wanda Beach murders, the Ivan Milat murders, all existed in the shadow of the Beaumont case. In some ways, the Beaumont case is the original modern Australian true crime case. It was the first case to be extensively covered, extensively investigated, extensively debated. It set the template for how Australian society would understand and discuss missing children and unsolved crimes. More than 50 years later, the Beaumont case still resonates. It still appears in true crime documentaries. It still appears in books about unsolved mysteries. It is still referenced when people discuss the safety of children or the dangers of strangers. The case has become woven into Australian culture, into the national consciousness. The disappearance of 3 children on Australia Day 1966 has become a defining moment in Australian history. In 1966, the tools available to find missing children were limited. There were no security cameras. There were no cell phones. There was no GPS. There was no way to track a vehicle's movement or to immediately broadcast an image of a missing child to the entire nation. When the Beaumont children disappeared, finding them depended on eyewitness accounts and luck. It depended on someone remembering something important. It depended on someone coming forward with information. It depended on the old-fashioned methods of detective work, interviewing witnesses, following leads, and hoping that some thread of evidence would lead somewhere. By the time modern forensic technology became available, decades had passed. The original crime scene had long since been compromised. The physical evidence that might have existed in 1966 had long since been destroyed. DNA testing, which could have been revolutionary in solving the case, could not be applied to a case where no bodies had been found and no crime scene had been properly preserved. This is one of the great tragedies of the Beaumont case. It occurred just at the edge of the modern era. A few years later, and security cameras might have captured the abduction. A few years later, and modern forensic techniques might have been available. But the Beaumont children disappeared in that narrow window between the old world and the new world. They disappeared before the technology that would have been needed to find them was invented. Some people have theorized that if the Beaumont case occurred today, with modern technology and modern investigation techniques, it would be solved quickly. Security camera footage would show what happened. Cell phone records would show where people were. DNA evidence would solve the case in months rather than remaining unsolved for decades. In the modern world, Jane, Arnna, and Grant would not have vanished. They would have been found. Their killer would have been caught. Their case would have been resolved. But they did not disappear in the modern world. They disappeared in 1966. And that single fact has meant that, more than 50 years later, the mystery remains unsolved. There is a possibility that the Beaumont children's bodies are in the ocean, that they were taken to beach, drowned or killed, and then weighted down or simply abandoned in the water, that they are still there in the depth of the ocean near Glenelg Beach, their remains slowly decomposing, their skeletons becoming part of the seafloor. If this is true, if this is where they are, then they remain undiscovered because the ocean is vast and deep and does not easily give up its secrets. The ocean is a place where things can be lost and remain lost forever. A body in the ocean is not like a body buried in the ground. It is not like a body hidden in a building. It is subject to the forces of currents and tides and time itself. Over the years, there have been periodic searches of the ocean floor near Glenelg Beach. Police have dredged sections of the seafloor. Volunteers have dubbed the search for remains. But the ocean is big, and the resources available to search it are limited. There could be entire sections of the seafloor that have never been thoroughly searched. There is a certain poetry to the idea that the Beaumont children might be in the ocean. Glenelg Beach is where they were last seen. It would make a dark kind of sense if they never left the beach, if they never went beyond the area where their mother had let them go to buy food. It would mean that the search for them, in a very real sense, was always taking them back to the place where they were lost. But it is also possible that the children are not in the ocean at all, that they were taken away from the beach, transported to another location, and buried somewhere on land, a disused quarry, a forest, a remote area where they would never be found, not by accident and not by design. There are thousands of places around Adelaide where the remains of 3 children could be hidden, where they could be buried or disposed of in a way that would make them nearly impossible to find. The not knowing about the physical location of the children is another aspect of the mystery that makes it so unsettling. There is no grave to visit. There is no place where parents can go to mourn. There is only absence, only the not knowing, only the endless possibility of where they might be. Beyond Derek Percy, there have been other suspects in the Beaumont case over the years. Men who were investigated, men whose names emerged in police records, men who fit certain profiles or who had certain connections to the case. One suspect was a man named Marcus Marsden. He was a known child abuser and rapist who was active in Adelaide during the time of the Beaumont disappearance. He had been interviewed by police in connection with the case, but there was no physical evidence linking him to the children's disappearance. The investigation led nowhere. Another suspect was a man named Robert Beard. He had made strange statements about the Beaumont case. He had given interviews claiming to have information about what happened, but when police investigated, his stories did not check out. His alibi for the day of the disappearance held. He was cleared as a suspect. There were others, many others, men whose names have been mentioned in connection with the case. Men who had some connection to Glenelg Beach or to Adelaide more broadly. Men who had some history that made them seem like possible suspects. But none of them were ever proven to have taken the Beaumont children. The problem with suspects in the Beaumont case is that there are too many possible suspects and not enough evidence against any of them. Any man who was in Adelaide on January 26, 1966, any man who had access to children, any man who had a dark history, all of them could potentially be the person responsible. But without evidence, without the ability to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, there remain only suspects, only theories, only shadows, and so the case remains open. The file sits in a police archive somewhere in South Australia. It is occasionally pulled out. It is occasionally investigated. But the fundamental facts remain the same. 3 children disappeared. The person or persons responsible were never identified or prosecuted, and the case remains unsolved. If there's a question that haunts the Beaumont case more than any other, it is this. Why? Why were there no answers? Why could the case not be solved? Why, in a modern developed nation with advanced police forces and sophisticated investigation techniques, could 3 children simply vanish and never be found? There are several possible answers to this question. The first is simple chance. The perpetrator might have been someone who had no connection to Adelaide, someone who was passing through, someone who committed the crime and then left, never to return to Adelaide again. In that scenario, solving the case would require that person be caught for another crime, that they confess to the Beaumont kidnapping, or that they provide some other way of being connected to crime. Without that connection, without that additional crime or confession, they would remain unknown. The second answer relates to the nature of crime and detection. Not all crimes are solved. Even with modern forensic techniques, even with extensive investigations, some crimes remain unsolved. This is the bitter truth of crime investigation. The detective shows on television suggest that crimes can always be solved if you just look hard enough, if you just interview the right witness, if you just find the crucial piece of evidence. But in reality, many crimes go unsolved. Many perpetrators never face justice. The Beaumont case might simply be one of those crimes, a genuine mystery that cannot be solved with the information available. The third answer is more sinister. It is possible that the person or persons responsible for taking the Beaumont children were protected in some way. It is possible that evidence was lost or destroyed. It is possible that a potential suspect had connections that protected them from investigation. It is possible that institutional failure or corruption prevented the case from being solved. This is not provable, but it is theoretically possible. What is clear is that Jim and Marion Beaumont never received the answer to their question. They never knew what happened to their children. They never knew if they had suffered. They never knew if they had been alive for days or weeks after their disappearance, or if they had been killed immediately. They never knew where their bodies were. They never had the chance to give their children a proper burial, to say a proper goodbye. This is the real tragedy of the Beaumont case. It is not just that 3 children disappeared. It is that the people who loved them most were never given closure. They were never given answers. They were left in a state of permanent uncertainty, forever wondering what happened, forever questioning whether they could have done something different on that day in January 1966. As of March 2023, the Beaumont children have been missing for 57 years. 57 years of no word. 57 years of no communication. 57 years of silence. If they had lived, Jane Beaumont would be 66 years old. Arnna Beaumont would be 64. Grant Beaumont would be 61. They would be grandparents. Perhaps they would be retired or working their final years before retirement. They would have lived entire lives. They would have seen wars and political changes and the rise of the internet. They would have experienced love and heartbreak and the full spectrum of human experience. But they didn't live. Or if they did, if they survived their abduction and lived into adulthood, they did so away from their family, away from their home, unknown and unrecognized. The silence is almost unbearable to think about. 57 years is longer than a human lifetime. It is longer than most careers. It is longer than most marriages. And yet the mystery of the Beaumont children remains unresolved. Unresolved through all of that time. Unresolved through political changes and technological changes and social changes. The case seems frozen in time, a cold case from 1966, never aging, never being solved, never providing answers. There is a photograph of the three Beaumont children that is iconic to the case. It shows them before the disappearance. They are smiling at the camera. They are dressed in summer clothes. They look happy and innocent and unaware of the fate that awaits them. That photograph has been republished thousands of times. It has been shown on television. It has been printed in newspapers and magazines. It has become the face of the case. But there is no photograph of them after 1966. There is no image of them as they grew up. There is no record of what happened to them after that day at the beach. Their lives ended or transformed at that moment, and we have no way of knowing what came after. In recent years, there have been renewed efforts to solve the Beaumont case using modern investigative techniques. In 2016, 50 years after the disappearance, the South Australian police released new information and new appeals for public assistance. They offer a reward for information. They suggested that there might be people who knew something but had never come forward. The 2016 anniversary brought the case back into public consciousness. True crime podcasts discussed it. Television programs revisited it. New documentaries were made. A whole new generation of Australians learned about the Beaumont children. Even though the case was 50 years old, the renewed attention generated new tips and new leads, though none of them seemed to lead anywhere conclusive. In 2022, when Percy died, there was a brief surge of hope that he might confess to additional crimes before his death. There was speculation about whether he had provided information about the Beaumont case, but no definitive information emerged. Percy took whatever knowledge he had to his grave. Today, the Beaumont case remains open. It is periodically investigated. New leads are followed up. Old evidence is occasionally re-examined. But the fundamental truth remains. Without new evidence, without new witnesses, without some breakthrough that changes the nature of the investigation, the case seems likely to remain unsolved. This is the modern reality of cold cases. With advances in forensic science, with advances in investigative technique, some cold cases have been solved. DNA evidence has exonerated wrongly convicted criminals and identified actual perpetrators. But DNA requires physical evidence. It requires bodies or crime scenes. The Beaumont case has neither. And so even modern forensic science seems powerless to solve it. There are some investigators who hold out hope. They believe that someone knows what happened. They believe that if the right person could be found, if the right pressure could be applied, if the right incentive could be offered, the case might be solved. They point out that 50 years have passed, that people's loyalties change over time, that someone who protected the perpetrator in 1966 might be willing to come forward now. But this is hope more than probability, and hope alone has not solved the Beaumont case in 57 years. In the end, what remains of the Beaumont case is a profound mystery. 3 children vanished on a summer day in 1966, and more than 50 years later, we still do not know what happened to them. We have theories. We have suspects. We have eyewitness accounts and investigative files, and decades of speculation. But we do not have answers. We do not know where the children are. We do not know who took them or how. We do not know if they suffered or if their deaths were quick. We do not know where their bodies are or if they were ever buried. What we do know is that Marion and Jim Beaumont were devastated by the disappearance of their children. We know that they spent the rest of their lives wondering. We know that they died without getting the closure that might have brought them peace. We know that the Beaumont case changed Australian culture, changed how we think about childhood and safety and the dangers that lurk in public spaces. We know that there was a man named Percy who fit the profile of the perpetrator so perfectly that he cannot be ignored. We know that he was a predator who preyed on children. We know that he committed terrible crimes. And we know that he died without ever being convicted of the Beaumont children's disappearance. But knowing these things does not solve the case. Understanding the context does not explain what happened. Being aware of the suspects does not lead to closure. The Beaumont case remains unsolved, and there is a possibility that it will remain unsolved forever. There is a possibility that the person or persons responsible are dead. There is a possibility that the evidence that would solve the case is lost or destroyed. There is a possibility that we will never know what happened to Jane, Arnna, and Grant Beaumont. And that possibility, that we might never know, is perhaps the most terrifying aspect of the case. In our modern world, we expect answers. We expect that mysteries can be solved, that crimes can be investigated, that truth will eventually emerge. But the Beaumont case suggests that sometimes mysteries persist. Sometimes answers do not come. Sometimes we are left in a state of permanent uncertainty. The Beaumont children would be adults now if they had lived. They would have families of their own. They would have had careers and relationships and all the experiences that make up a human life. But they did not get those opportunities. 3 lives were interrupted, cut short, stolen, if that is the right word, on a summer day in 1966. And 57 years later, we still do not know why. The beach at Glenelg still exists. Families still go there on Australia Day. Children still play in the sand and swim in the water. The beach itself has moved on. The community has moved on. The nation has moved on. But the mystery remains. The disappearance of Jane, Arnna, and Grant Beaumont remains unsolved, a wound that is never fully healed, a question that has never fully been answered. This is a legacy of the Beaumont case. Not just the mysterious disappearance of 3 children, but the reminder that some questions do not have answers. Some mysteries remain mysterious. Some losses remain permanent. And sometimes all we are left with is the not knowing, the uncertainty, the endless wondering about what happened that day at the beach on Australia Day 1966. The Beaumont children are gone. We do not know where. We do not know how. We do not know why. And after 57 years, it seems increasingly likely that we never will. But they are not forgotten. As long as their case remains unsolved, as long as people continue to discuss it and investigate it and wonder about it, Jane, Arnna, and Grant Beaumont will not be forgotten. Their mystery will endure. And perhaps it is all that can be said in the end, that they are remembered even if they are not found, that their story is told even if their fate remains unknown. The beach at Glenelg is still there. The sun still sets over the water. Families still gather to celebrate. But somewhere in that scene, in that landscape, in that moment of summer and celebration, 3 children are missing. 3 children who should be there, who should be alive, who should be adults going about their lives. But they are not, and we do not know why. That is the Beaumont mystery. That is the question that remains unanswered after 57 years. That is the absence that defines one of Australia's most haunting unsolved cases.